Resident Evil 6 may be the single worst mainline entry in the franchise. It's definitely the most divisive, and for good reason. At release, it was roughly twice the size of the next biggest RE title, and for the most part, ditches any semblance of survival horror to go all in on Michael Bay-esque cheesy action movie spectacle. But even upon release, it had its defenders. People who claimed it was flawed but ultimately misunderstood, and a lot of fun. I was not one of those people. I fucking hated this game when I first played it. I finished it out of stubborn determination and despised pretty much every second of it, which made me really feel its bloated runtime. I hated the controls, the enemies, the weapons, the fact that there was no real inventory to speak of, yet you'd somehow find yourself managing it just the same. I hated the linearity of it all, the QuickTime events, and the easy to fuck up gameplay switch-ups that came out of nowhere. I hated the story, the dialogue, and the new characters, Piers in particular. I also hated how they did some returning characters dirty, especially Chris and Ada. But at the start of the year, for whatever reason, I got the itch to replay this game, and something fucking crazy happened. I loved it. I fucking loved the absolute shit out of it. I couldn't believe it. The controls are super tight and responsive, and provide a level of knee-jerk reactivity to the action that no Resident Evil before or since has managed. The guns all feel punchy and satisfying, and the melee weapons are great too. The enemies are a bit of a mixed bag, but most of them are pretty good. The Juavo in particular are really cool. A natural progression from the Ganados and Magini, the Juavo are smarter, more skilled with weapons, and able to adapt to various situations. All this is a roundabout way of saying the enemy AI got a bit of an upgrade between 5 and 6. The thing that most impressed me about the Juavo is how their bodies react to damage. Any physical trauma inflicted initiates this crazy, rapid healing process that causes mutations, often resulting in the injured Juavo becoming even more dangerous. The story is still a joke, as is the dialogue, but I'm much less down on it these days as it's less remarkably bad and more on par for the course in the RE series. Even the best RE games have shit story and worse dialogue, and that's part of their charm. Sure, it's diminishing returns in games like 5 and 6, but it seems hypocritical to call them out for it, but not the others. I could go on, but the last thing I'll say is how wrong I was about the various settings of RE6. Tall Oaks University, the submarine, and Edonia are all fantastic settings that, if got a little more polish and we weren't handheld through much of it all, would hold their own against the likes of Raccoon City, Rockford Island, and the Spencer Mansion. Lanxiang in particular deserves a lot more love. The underwater facility blew my mind, recalling the Seaton ship from Perfect Dark in places. And the city itself, from the streets to the apartment complexes to the waterfront, is my absolute favorite location in any Resident Evil game. It's a goddamn work of art. Somehow, I had fallen in love with Resident Evil 6. It was a Christmas miracle, but in like April, which makes it even more special, I decided. But that said, of all the original Resident Evil games, 6 is the one that stands to gain the most from a remake. And while I can imagine some people at Capcom might just want to pretend it doesn't exist, I'm sure there's no small amount of people that are chomping at the bit to get a chance to correct its mistakes and make it the game it was always meant to be. I'm sure we all have different ideas of what a remake of 6 in the vein of the recent remakes might look like. I've given it an unhealthy amount of thought over the last year. And honestly, I think the potential remake needs to double down on one of the game's biggest criticisms and make it even longer. Hear me out. When replaying the game, my biggest issue was that we didn't get enough time in any one area to really get a feel for it, to really enjoy it. The game was constantly throwing action set pieces at us and moving us from place to place, and the overall dynamic suffered for it. The whole time I was playing it, I was just thinking, if they cut the boring shit and fleshed out the best areas so that we got more of the good at the expense of the bad, then it could be a masterpiece. But what part would you cut? I wouldn't cut any one part, but instead release RE6 as 2 separate games. Part 1 would cover Edonia and maybe Tall Oaks, with Ada's submersible chapter as an introduction/tutorial. That way we could cover the chapter that kicks off the story without it taking up too much time. It was largely overblown anyway. From there, the game could play a bit like the RE3 remake. Fairly linear, with some open and optional areas, alternating perspectives, and progressing chronologically. Not only would that make the story easier to follow, but it could add an element of tension and mystery to it all. Every time we switch between Jake and Chris's stories, we'd leave on a cliffhanger. This way, we could flesh out Edonia and the mountains and get a real feel for the place and the conflict going on within it. We could spend some time setting up the tension between Jake and Chris, as well as the mystery behind Carla Radams. I don't know if I'm saying that right. The Edonia story also has a sort of Empire Strikes Back style bad ending, with Chris's entire team getting wiped out, him getting amnesia and alcoholism, and Jake and Sherry getting kidnapped. It's a great place to leave the audience hanging for the second game. Oh yeah, spoilers for Resident Evil 6. As for the Tall Oaks part, I don't know. I wouldn't want to tack it on after such a great ending, so maybe it could be DLC. After all, you could argue that it isn't really necessary to the story. Yeah, there are some important developments regarding Helena, Simmons, and Ada, but nothing that couldn't be a few throwaway lines during gameplay later on. And despite Leon's campaign being arguably the best, I found much of the Tall Oak stuff to be pretty lacking. I love the university and the city stuff. It all felt very classic Raccoon City, and clearly by design. But the graveyard, the church, and the catacombs dragged on and clashed with the overall tone of the game. One possible angle is to have the Tall Oaks University and town stuff as DLC for the first game, and have a shortened version of the crypt and church sections as the tutorial for the second game, the way Ada's first chapter is condensed and repurposed as a tutorial for the first part. I'm not 100% sold on that idea, because I think Jake and Sherry's escape from the lab would be a much cooler tutorial scene, and a great way to kick off part 2. So maybe the catacombs could be relegated to a cutscene at the end of the DLC or something. Speaking of the second, I drastically changed the style between the two games. While the Adonia stuff is reminiscent of the RE3 remake, fairly linear and occasionally jumping between perspectives, I'd have the RE6 remake part 2 work much more like the RE2 remake. The city of Lanxiang would be huge and interconnected, and instead of separate stories, Chris and Piers, Jake and Sherry, Leon and Helena, and even Ada and Hunk, who I decided should be her partner for some reason, would all operate closer to how Leon and Claire did in RE2. They'd still keep all their own unique sections, but there'd be much more overlap between them all in the moment-to-moment exploration. If you want the remake to do right by the original, there's no way this approach would work perfectly, so some compromise is definitely necessary here. But speaking very generally, having a much more fleshed out Lanxiang to explore would be amazing. And the campaigns would all be different enough that it'd be worth playing through them all. And because the game was split in two, it wouldn't be as overwhelming. Like the classic RE trilogy, Part 2's story is essentially confined to one city over one night. Narrowing the scope like this allows the writing to go deeper, and I think it would make for an amazing game. No joke, I honestly think that a game like this, done right, written by people much more talented than me, could be the best Resident Evil game ever made. Keep the atmosphere, but give it more dynamics, suspense, dread, and horror to keep it interesting. Keep the action, but tone down the Michael Bay attitude. Keep the controls from the RE4 remake, maybe with a bit more mobility. Give us guns we can upgrade and customize, and maybe make ammo a bit more scarce. It's a tall order for sure, but I truly think that under all that earth, there's a gem of a game just dying to be carved out. And if the last 3 remakes are any indication, the team over at Capcom are more than capable of doing it justice.